Welcome back to the theme component of the Trigun Retrospective. Now that we've looked at the theme of running away from problems, we are going to look at the idea of how one solves problems, or at least how much agency one applies to solve them. You see, Trigun is also a series which is big on agency, and how to use it, and how one uses it, and it explores it with its cast. You see, the cast is set on a spectrum of agency and agency use. On one hand, there is Vash, who, despite having the most agency of probably any character in the entire series, uses very little, if any, for a lot of it, until he learns to harness it. On the other end of the spectrum, there is Knives, who uses too much agency, as he becomes consumed by his quest to depopulate Gunsmoke and make it pure, or whatever it is he hopes to do. Now, of course, these are extremes of spectrums, and of course have their own flaws, as extremes of any spectrum tend to, and the rest of the characters fall somewhere in the middle. On Vash's end of the spectrum falls Millie, who, while in touch with the world and does not run from it and is aware of everything, she does not necessarily rock the boat too much and decides to go along with everything, as she is content with everything that's happening around her. A little further to Knives' end, there is Meryl, who uses her agency and is aware that she has it, although doesn't necessarily always use it the best, as she compromises her emotional integrity and represses how she feels many times. Closer to what Knives is then Wolfwood, who starts to show the malignant symptoms of using too much agency. As mentioned earlier, he is too proactive when solving his problems, and often goes a little overboard when doing so. He decides to use too much of his power sometimes, and is prone to snap judgments, some of which may not necessarily be the best, and which lead to moral internal conflict for him. Now, of course, we will explore the spectrum and see what Trigun has to tell us about agency and how we use it. We'll start with the extremes. Now there is Vash, who is a drifter, who has no real home, and who is pretty content to just kind of let the world dictate where he goes for the first half of the series. He goes to a new town, he talks to some town folks, he does a thing, he usually gets kicked out by circumstances not under his control, or decides to leave before such circumstances come to him. He is free, like a tumbleweed blowing across the planet, not really deciding where he goes, and simply allowing the world to decide things for him. Now, this sounds idyllic at first, however it does lead to one of the key criticisms of his approach to agency, and how little he uses it. And that issue is that his problems still find him anyways. They still track him down. However, this approach does not let him use any of his agency to actually tackle them. He fears that using too much agency may corrupt who he is as a person, or may endanger the lives of those around him, and as a result, this fear leads him to using almost no agency. So, even though he's very powerful, he sort of becomes a pawn to those trying to confront him. He allows Legato's schemes to get a little out of hand. He allows Knives to depopulate villages. He allows others to dictate where he goes and how he lives his life, because he doesn't want to use any of his agency to confront them at first. Now, of course, he grows out of this and he learns to confront his problems, and Wolfwood helps him along the way to harness his great agency, but his overly restrained approach inhibits his ability to tackle problems. All of this is ironic, of course, because of all the entire cast, Vash probably has the most agency if he decided to use it, and could have probably made the series last only a couple episodes if he really decided that he was going to go get Knives. Next, of course, is Millie, who, while exercising emotional wisdom, and is very aware of how she feels, and sometimes the cruel nature of the world, is also aware of the fact that she cannot necessarily change everything by herself. No one can, really. And for this reason, she is content to kind of just go along with Vash. She represents a kind of middle ground, although still leaning closer to Vash on the agency spectrum. She decides that while she can't just control external factors, she'll be aware of them, and that she'll be aware of how she feels, and that she will use her agency to instead stabilize herself so that she can best navigate things which are not necessarily in her control. I think that this is a very healthy life approach, in fact, and I do commend her ability to remain stable in spite of the tragic loss of Wolfwood and the fact that she's traveling around with a natural disaster guy, i.e. Vash. Next to her is Meryl, and this is where we start to see the impact of using too much agency, or at least misusing it. You see, Meryl's problem and her great character arc is her learning not to repress how she feels, of coming to terms with her emotions and expressing them in a healthy and productive manner. Of course, she learns to do this, but before she learns to do this, she uses her agency against herself. She uses her agency to try and repress her emotions, and tell herself she doesn't feel certain ways, or that she does feel certain ways, and this starts to represent an overstepping of boundaries, although in this case she's overstepping her own boundaries, as she's kind of stepping on her own emotional toes. She uses her agency in a kind of blunt fashion to try and control how she feels, to try and dictate how she's going to live her life, without necessarily thinking about how to do so within the parameters of the real world. She thinks she can simply tell herself that she feels a certain way, and that she will. And trying to brute force these things, of course, leads to consequences. She gets out of touch with how she feels and suffers stress and health-related issues due to this. As noted in her own video, she starts to become nervous and make some questionable judgment. However, her use of agency does not slip into the point where she starts to negatively impact others. Wolfwood, in fact, is the character that represents this. As the most proactive member of the protagonists, his great use of his great power has led him to compromise his ideals several times, and while this has resulted in actions which of course have hurt himself, as he is now aware of his compromised ideals, they've also hurt people who may not necessarily should have been hurt in many scenarios. He's aware of this, of course, and this rebounds on him, and it also harms him, as it leads him to realize that he is a morally compromised man. He has been a little too proactive, and the use of all of his power has led him to become a man which he does not necessarily respect, or a man he does not necessarily wish to be. That is, a man who has used his power to conduct many morally questionable acts, even if they are in the pursuit of a greater good. He's starting to represent the idea of using too much agency. This is also why he and Vash balance out very well, though. Since they fall on opposite ends of the spectrum, they markedly temper each other out, and they both learn from each other. Finally, on the very end of the spectrum is Knives. Now, Knives is a sadist, a man who simply does not care about how his actions affect others, and simply wants to see things done his way. He's also a man with great physical power, a man of great agency. One could say he's even dominant. Now, as a figure with such demigod-like powers, and one who's not afraid to use them, he shows the full horrors of the abuse of agency. He uses all of his agency to try and bend the world to his will, and as a result, conducts many, many morally bad things. He depopulates villages. He spends a 26 series anime trying to screw with Vash. He just does a lot of not good things. And while this doesn't bother him internally, as he's committed to what he's doing, it does show us that unrestricted use of power does cause many external issues at the very least. He's done nothing but destroy when we boil down to it. He's doomed the colonists to live on a planet of questionable worth. He's made life living hell for his own brother, and he's destroyed the lives of even those who he's kind of allowed to live on Gunsmoke, as he uses them as pawns in his game to try and mess with his brother, i.e. he kills innocents to get to Vash. He shows us that without a moral compass to temper our agency, there is no good way to use it. While power is a tool, any tool used outside of safe parameters is dangerous. Now, power can also be used for good, as Vash proves when he learns to use his agency and power to confront Knives, but can also be used for bad. And I would like to say that as a tool, power does not necessarily have moral leanings in it of itself, and the moral implications more lie in how it is used. However, the fact that Knives uses his so blatantly is probably somewhat connected to his lack of a moral compass. It's probably no wonder that the better of the two brothers is afraid of power, and the worse of the two brothers relishes it completely. And the spectrum of agency shows us the moral implications of power, and how that using too much of it can often lead to blatant evil, but using too little of it can lead to what I call negligent evil. Now, negligent evil is not something advertently done to harm others, but actions which cause harm to others because it didn't prevent something else. And Vash is a textbook example of this. Vash is a very nice man. I would not call him evil. You would borderline say he's a saint, in fact. However, he has conducted negligent evil by not using enough of his power. He has not responsibly used it, and as a result, things which should have been his problem to solve have spiraled out of control and affected those around him. While he has not intentionally hurt anyone, it can be argued he has inadvertently hurt people by not using his power, and this shows us the need to use some power. It shows us the need to control how we take on the world in a constructed manner. Because if we don't take on the world at all, we can still be guilty of negligence, and still hurt the ones we love, or at the very least leave to circumstances that are not necessarily the best for them. All of this goes on to show a central point of Trigun, and that is that we all have agency, and it's up to us to use it in the best way possible. Of course, we don't want to go to either extreme of the spectrum, we don't want to completely ignore it, and we don't want to overuse it, but we do want to use it to ensure that we can live our best lives.